those are the elements of the language. Now let me tell you the origin of the Sunflower, which is my own company, Ascend. It was formed in 1989 by myself, my wife, Terry, and 3 other co-founders of the company. Originally, we intended to build this box, which was about the size of that podium, which would connect a new digital service called ISDN to the computers that corporations had. We thought we could be the on-ramp, if you will, or the off-ramp for the computers onto a new digital service that the telephone companies would offer. It sounds pretty good. We actually went to venture capitalists, which is a mechanism in Silicon Valley by which you raise money. And we raised a couple of $1 million from a couple of the best venture people. And then we went off and started building the product. And as my engineers, I think we had 3 engineers in the company at that point. As we went off building the product, I went off being the marketing and salesperson, the only marketing and salesperson in the company. And I went out talking to prospects, trying to line up customers. What I discovered very rapidly was a bit of a problem. The problem was that the underlying digital service, which we were going to connect to, was not available, that the telephone company had fibbed. They hadn't actually rolled it out according to their best schedule. So we had a bit of a problem. We also were running out of money. We had burnt through all the money in building this complex product. But luckily, we actually had found another investor. The other investor, even though he was told that there might be some problem with the rollout, invested a couple of more $1 million. And I think he did that mostly not because of the product idea, by the way. I think he did it mostly because of the team. He really thought the team would be able to adjust if the product idea didn't work out. Well, as it turns out, the product idea didn't work out. Very shortly after he invested, a couple of months after, I had to tell the board, and it was an interesting board meeting, that it was a good news and bad news. The bad news always comes first, so here comes the bad news. The bad news was that there was no digital service to connect to as far as I could tell, and I had been around the country trying to sell and talk to people. And they said, well, that was very interesting, and the guy who had last put his money in, actually, he dug around in his bag looking for the business plan, and he picked it up and he threw it in the air, and it went all over the place. And then he said, well, so what's the good news? Do you have another idea? And we said, well, yeah, we do have another idea. We have a whole new concept called bandwidth on demand that would use the existing services so that the underlying condition of having a new service wouldn't be there. We'd have existing services. Well, fortunately, they allowed us to implement that. And we went ahead and implemented it, despite, by the way, that the telephone companies of the world, and at that time it was AT&T and Sprint and MCI and people like that, felt that the product was not buildable. It was impossible. It went against the laws of physics inside the network. Well, luckily for us, they were wrong. We actually built the product. It did work. We built a company about 15 or 16 million in sales over a year or two time. Now, that sounds pretty good, except for one thing. The one thing is they had put $20 million into the company. And so we hadn't even reached in sales what they had put in investment. And that's not going to compute. That doesn't carry very far. So I actually had to ask once more for permission to get a stay of execution, because once again they were going to fold and terminate the company. This time they were actually going to terminate it by selling it. And when they sold it, they had already found a buyer. They were going to sell it, and they were going to take all of the money. So all of the work that myself and my team of engineers and all the other people had put in would be down the drain. That didn't seem like a really good idea. So we came up and we said, give us a little time and we'll come up with another idea. And they said, okay, you have 3 or 4 months. This begins the origin of the Sunflower, that 3 or 4 months. In that time frame, a couple of things happened. One very lucky thing happened, which was I was snowbound in the Sierra Mountains. And when I was snowbound, I actually read an article by C.K. Prada, who was a professor in Harvard, who was talking about Honda, that original example that I gave you, and talking about core competencies. And I realized that he was onto something. and that I needed to think of my business in terms of core competencies. And that if I did that, I might have a chance to reinvent it. Because where it wasn't going to go anywhere. In fact, it was going to be sold. Well, we had a little meeting finally when I got back from the Sierras. And I sat down with my engineers. And we came up with what we do well was dialing. Dialing. We could dial in the sense of computer dialing. We were kind of masters of that. We could do it with any kind of protocol or switch or any country or any time, any place. We said, well, that's interesting, but who cares? I mean, what do we need this thing for? Well, we started putting up different possibilities. Well, the video stuff we had already been doing, so that one didn't count. We put up the internet. Now, this was 1990. The internet was just a sort of gleam in everyone's eye in 1990. It was very early in the internet cycle. We put up remote access. That's a simple or small office connecting to a larger office. And telecommuting is very simple, a person from home trying to connect into his office. So we put up those 3 different possibilities. And then we started to think about how do we discern one from the other, and which one do we work on? We're a tiny little company. We can't work on all of them. Plus, we were still doing the video business. So the matrix idea is what sort of saved our bacon here. We came up with a set of criteria on the left side. Value proposition, which I've already mentioned. High growth market, that means, is the market growing? Yes or no? And if so, how much? The use of the core competencies. So in our case, dialing. Is the dialing is like the engine in Honda's case? So we're using it a lot in that market area up on the top line? Yes or no? And I use 2/3 as a rough estimate of something that is the dividing line. Market invisibility. An interesting criteria. Some markets, even though they're growing, can be invisible. The internet market was all these internet service providers spread out around the country. They were small, tiny, 2 people and a dog, and they were serving tiny little regions. If you went and talked to them, you'd discover they were growing, but no one was actually talking to them. So all the major computer networking companies that produce hardware and software, they weren't even talking to these people. So that market was invisible. It was visible only to the people that, like myself, that was out talking to them. Strategic. Strategic meant if you build the product and you sell it into that market, is it really an important thing for that marketplace? Well, heck yes. Take the internet example. Without Ascend's equipment, what became Ascend's equipment, there is no internet. It was the infrastructure for the entire internet. Every single point of presence, which is a term of art, which is hundreds of thousands of them around the world, which service a 5-mile radius, basically, were controlled by Ascend. We had an 85% market share before it was over. So yeah, it was strategic, all right. Competitive barrier. Does your core technology have a competitive barrier against other potential competitors in that market? Really important. In our case, dialing. It doesn't sound like much, but as it turns out, it was an arcane activity. And only about, estimate, of course, a dozen people in the world knew how to do it well, and we probably had 6 of them at that point. So yeah, we had a competitive advantage. And my favorite, get a check. This is an interesting one. When you go out and talk to customers or prospects, and now you're talking to them not with a product because you have nothing to sell, but you're talking to them like I'm talking to you about a concept. I have these dialing capabilities, and you have potentially a problem that might use that dialing capabilities. Do you think we could get together, and if I built you a product that you helped specify, would you write me a check? Now, this is an interesting concept. This is a customer writing a check, actually purchasing a product before it's built. And you say that's impossible. No, it isn't. And as you're going to see in a second, we did exactly that. So when we scored the internet against remote access and telecommuting and video, we gave it different scores. You can see the internet kept getting 9s and 10s. The others did okay, but not as well. And then at the end, we just added things up, and we said, well, it looks like the internet is the thing we ought to focus our time on. So at this point in time, all we have is we need to focus our time on the internet. We need to go out and talk to the internet people. Well, again, it's 1990. Luckily, there was actually a book of the different internet providers. There was about 400 of them at that time. We decided amongst the four of us to talk to all 400. We would each take 100, and we'd give ourselves, I think, 5 or 6 weeks. And in that 5 or 6 weeks, we had hoped to go around the country and talk to all of them. Well, I was, by the way, in the Midwest. That was my territory. I was chunking around in the Midwest. Most of these internet providers were tiny. There are a couple of people, they serviced a region or a town or a county. And we were tiny as well, so it's a good match. And what we discovered is that the internet was exploding, that every 6 months they were doubling the number of subscribers, but the internet providers had a very serious problem. They had to guess how much new equipment they needed to add. They needed to add a new box and a new wire for every new potential customer. And they had to guess what flavor to do, which kind of communication protocol to do. So it was like a nightmare for them. And as we went and talked to these internet providers, somewhere around P, we were doing it alphabetically, we found a little company called PSINet. It was in Washington, D.C., and a cafe somewhere in Washington, D.C. I was talking with him. I don't know why I was there. But in any case, he then turned to me at one point and drew on a napkin a box. And he said, can you build a box with 4 high-speed lines in it that each of the lines masqueraded and acted like it was servicing 25 customers? So the one box could then service 100 customers. Now, formerly, or currently, or back then, currently, you'd need 100 boxes and 100 wires to do that. So he was proposing a tiny little box that would service 100 users. And of course I said, yeah, we can build it, of course. And then I went into the model of get the check. I actually said, if we build it, you're going to give me an order right now? And he said, well, how can I give you an order, Rob? You don't have it built. You don't have a price on it. I said, well, that's not a problem. We're going to figure the price out right here, you and I. I asked him, how much does it cost to do 100 users today? And he said, it costs me $1,000 a user, which is $100,000. And I said, well, that's very interesting. I'm going to give you this box. Sounds like a game show, doesn't it? I'm going to give you this box for $50,000. That's a savings of $50,000 for every 100 users. And he said, done. He signed an order for 4 units, $200,000, with the condition that I do not cash any checks, nor did he give me a check. Then when I actually brought the product, he would test it thoroughly, and if he accepted it, it was a done deal, and we got our check, which was fine with me because I took that order, and remember the board, they're still sitting back there pretty flamed out on this whole company, and I brought that order to the board. And I said, I think we found a gold mine. And as an example of the gold mine, I think customers are ordering and I don't even have a product yet. And they actually agreed it was a little unusual, and they actually then gave us the 6 months to a year to actually explore this. We explored it. The company grew from that 16 million that I had mentioned to 40 million, to 160 million, to 580 million, to 1.2 billion in revenue, to 2.6 billion in revenue, all in the back of this little sunflower idea and this little product. Now, of course, we did variations on the product. And I might add, if you notice, we also did those other pedals. You know, every year we'd add another pedal. We added the remote access pedal, the telecommuting pedal, and we continued with the video. And they were nice little businesses. I mean, they weren't so little. 400 million is not a little business. So this worked out so well that the Sunflower became a big friend of mine.